Let's talk in this last moment about forgiveness, reconciliation, but following mimetic theory. This is the second part of the reflection this morning. It's about facing the anthropological and social dilemma of evil. The question about evil has been challenging thinkers from all times. In trying to understand why evil and how can we overcome evil. The question of violence is a particular example of evil. And of course, in following Christian narrative, we have been phrasing the question of evil as a process of conversion from sin to grace, right? And since, following mimetic theory lens, is related to rivalry and sacrifice, the original sin, according to this perspective, I'm following James Allison's book on mimetic theory and original sin, is the joy of being wrong, to discover that we are part of the process of rivalry, but at the same time we are called to be converted from this rivalry process, the satanic lie, and then following Jesus in a pacific mimesis. So it's a new way to understand sin, not following the Augustinian path, which now is very important because of Pope Leo. And it's an important reference, of course, in the great tradition, together with other great theologians. But sin is not only about the concupiscence in our lives. Well, desire is related to concupiscence. That's the term that Augustine was proposing to understand sin. But mainly moving towards the process of grace as a gift, coming from the victims, and only from the victims. Grace and the process of reconciliation and then forgiveness. Why only the victims? They have the potency to forgive. So forgiveness as a social process is a first approach, is a more historical in 20th century of trying to explore to visualize some examples. You know pretty well in South Africa what it means, what it meant some decades ago. The trilogy of memory, truth, and justice reparation is the first experience coming from 20th century healing process at a social scale through truth commissions. But after the Holocaust, trauma studies were facing this event using psychological, psychoanalytical, sociopolitical lens, but also neurosciences were involved in this process. How the victims of the Holocaust, a concentration camp, the survivors of torture or subhumanization performed by the Nazi regime against Jewish mainly, but also many other people like Muslims and then also queer people, how we can understand what's going on in this trauma. Trauma is about, of course, an emotion of being vulnerable, being humiliated by any kind of power, but at the same time it's not only emotional, it's also, there are even physiological roots, and then physiological scarcity, which is improved in some way through the process of the concentration camp. Trauma studies after the Holocaust were developed by the Jewish scholars, accompanying the victims to heal and reconnecting, for instance, the neurons who were damaged by these kind of experiences of trauma. Using, of course, medical methodologies, but also communal methodologies about community. The way to heal together, according to this research project, was deeply rooted in a communal aspect of healing. So the role of the others in order to remember, to talk about what happened, to create their coming out narrative as victims of a Holocaust. So memory is there, but memory has some particular challenges. For instance, following Paul Ricoeur, a great philosopher in France last century, He was a survivor. He described himself in a great book at the end of his life, an interview called Vivant jusqu'au bout, living until the end, something like that, right? Vivant jusqu'au bout. Vous êtes polyglot. You are polyglot, right? In this interview, he explained that he's a survivor of two kinds of traumas. His child committing suicide and a concentration camp. Because he was, as a French Protestant activist and scholar, he was supporting Jewish families and welcoming them in France. But he was also imprisoned because this activism. So he survived two traumas. And all his philosophy was driven by this kind of question. How can we overcome trauma? And he developed the philosophy of will. His main book is called Mémoire, Histoire, Oubli. Memory, history, and forgetting. Not forgiving. Huh? He was very cautious about this. Forgiveness is a horizon. It's never the starting point. That's his claim. But forgetting, olvido. Why he chose oubli? Forgetting, right? The victims, the first step in the process of reconciliation with themselves is forgetting in order to forgive. Well, let's talk about that. And probably your testimony will be also very inspiring in this case. So memory, according to Paul Ricoeur, has also some risks. Amnesia is a dysfunctionment of memory. We are not allowed to remember because of the trauma. Somebody suffering torture, rape, any kind of domestic violence, or to preserve his own identity, his, her own identity, there is a psychological dynamics that protect the individual, not allow them to remember. And this is amnesia, and needs to be healed using psychotherapy, psychology, psychoanalysis, and so on, helping the traumatic experience to be remembered. But it takes many time. It takes a while, sometimes years, decades. But there is another risk in memory when memory is amnesty. In a political system where after a war, a population is in some way or has been receiving the order to do not talk about the past. All right? It's forbidden to remember. And there is an amnesty. We will be talking about the future, not about the past. There's no guilty, there's no persecutors, there's no executioners, there's no victims. Let's move forward. And that's a risk of memory. That's why memory is so fragile. And the process of memory is about telling stories. It's a storytelling process. I like to remember a testimony of a woman in South African Truth Commission who used to say, I need to know the truth, the second element, to forgive, to know what happened. But memory is the first step. And truth is the second one. The truth according to the victims themselves, the survivors, and the perpetrators. And I will be just mentioning an example in Colombia, Colombia's Truth Commission, about the houses of memory that they prepared in different parts of the country in order to help the community to heal together. So truth is absolutely important, according to the victims and the perpetrators. And both, how can they reshape truth about the community? This is a long-term process, and that's why the horizon of justice is there. As reparation, accountability, but reconciliation still is on the horizon. It's not there, it's not the starting point, it's the goal of the process at a social scale. So, of course, there are particularly the lawyers, the global scale, and different NGOs, the United Nations. They were proposing what they call transitional justice in post-conflict states. And that's why an important element of this transitional justice are the truth commissions, who have been who raised in the second half of 20th century after the Second World War. This is just a list of different truth commissions. For instance, the first one started in Argentina in, ending the report in December 1983. It was focusing what the main trauma that the Argentinian society was facing, the disappearance of people, particularly political activists, by the military regime. So each one of those commissions were like exploring what the transitional justice is about in every context. Uganda in 96, in 86, Chile, of course, after the dictatorship in 1990, Chad in 1992, El Salvador, and they were moving from a more juridical approach to restoration towards a more anthropological and social analysis, including reconciliation of the nation as part of their the mission that they received. As you know, well, there were many others in Haiti, in South Africa, of course, the promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act in 1995. But every of these commissions was including, for instance, the first one talking about reconciliation in a very explicit way was the South African one, but also the Guatemalan, following the path opened by the South African Commission, was following this. And this is another list in Ghana, Timor-Leste, Peru, Morocco, Liberia, and so on. So what I want to emphasize here is the most recent experiences of the Truth Commission in Colombia. This is an infographic that in some way summarizes the work of 5 years they've been working on, trying to face the conflict that was raised 60 years of armed conflict in Colombia, 6 decades. So the results are there, almost 500,000 of victims, death during the armed conflict. And this is interesting, who were the deaths? 8 were civilians, every 10 deaths, and 2 were combatants. So the collateral damages, as usual in any war today, we're looking at that in Ukraine, in Gaza, and many other places, are the victims themselves. But this commission was also talking about the perpetrators. Who were the perpetrators during this civil war, 60 years armed conflict? They call that armed conflict. 45% paramilitaries. As you know, many of them there were private army paid by the owners of land, which were very wealthy families, but also by the US. By this AI. And then there was a particular strategy from the US to stop all kind of guerrilla movement in Latin America in what they called their backyard, right, of the United States. 27% of perpetrators were guerrilla, so explicit, like communist, socialist movements trying to change the government to reach out the power, and then 12% state agents. It's interesting also in this report what they call the extrajudicial killings by the states, ranging from the period between the beginning of the conflict, about 8,000 people, and then slowing down to 6,000. Another interesting element in this report is about sexual violence. As you know, particularly the Truth Commission also in the former Yugoslavia was also working on that aspect, sexual violence as a device of war, right? Victims of forced displacement, 8 million people almost. That's another important element, how the war is producing internal migration. Sexual violence, 92% of the victims there were women and girls, and also including queer communities, right? Which is interesting here is that, well, of course, the childhood was part of the victims, mainly minors, victims of recruitment. That's another way of creating violence among the people. And by the way, this is probably what the criminal mafias are doing today as a priority for them. They are killing people, but they are mainly controlling population, youth, in order to take control over their bodies and their minds. As consumers of drugs, of course, but also as farmers and then as technicians in laboratories producing fentanyl and other drugs. So this Truth Commission was led by the Jesuit in Colombia, Father Francisco de Roo, a great, not only activist in humanitarian human rights, but a great spiritual leader. You could invite him to Winter Living Theology. He's a great scholar also. He was trained in Colombia, but then as economist in the London School of Economics. So he could be a very interesting participant in this Winter Living Theology. I'm just suggesting some names, right? Of course, Jesuits. Well, those Truth Commissions, they represent an important moment in Western societies, also at a global scale, trying to help us to understand the urgency of processes of reconciliation as a society, not only as individuals in a personal manner, communities and families. And then the question is how mimetic desire can help us to understand better the process of reconciliation from inside. Not only truth commissions, accountability, which is important. And let me just go back to because I forgot to say something about this. I was mentioning just in the last talk. This Truth Commission was promoting what they called houses of memory and reconciliation. In different towns in the country, they were establishing some houses where the people were able to tell their stories in different ways, in a particular gathering, a public gathering, using arts, using also different kinds of methodologies, allowing the victims and the perpetrators to tell their stories. And then that was a first step, preparing some moments of dialogue, conversation, listening each other. Of course, there were many preconditions to be fulfilled. For instance, the victims, that they wanted really to openly talk about their trauma. The perpetrators, who were, many of them have been facing accusations, even jailed, but they wanted just also to be part of a process of encountering the victims. Because even they were allowed, for instance, some of them who were in jail to attend the gathering and then to talk, not as a part of a trial, but a part as a process of dialogue and conversation and mutual listening. So these houses of memory are a great example of a more communal approach to the reconciliation process. We need to go back to this kind of different anthropology. It's not about also punitive justice, or only about restorative. Yeah, but restorative includes the perpetrators and the community as the agency of the community themselves, right? The communities. And that's why, well, the second element I want to present here is how the mimetic theory can help us to understand from this perspective of the intelligence of the victim, this process of overcoming violence. There are three principles related to mimetic theory and this approach of the intelligence of the victim. The first one is the principle of everything, God's superabundant love. Because God is all the time leading the process, accompanying the victims, supporting the victims themselves, existing and re-existing, reinventing themselves. This is the source of their strength. That's the way James Allison was talking about the joy of being wrong. Even if I'm wrong, and I realize that I'm wrong doing something against somebody, I was forgiven since the beginning by God. And this superabundant love, asymmetrical love, it's a gratuitous love, is the starting point of the process of reconciliation. Acknowledging this deep experience of grace, original grace, not original sin. Mm-hmm. And remember the theology of icons? In the back of the icon is gold. It's a symbol of grace, of the light coming from inside, because we have been created as at the image of God. So, and then rediscovering Jesus as sacraments of God's mercy as forgiving victim. This is the second trend coming from the mimetic theory interpretation. And then realizing that revelation, that means God communicating her being, and I'm using her because of the feminist awareness, as a process of the forgiving victim. God is a superabundant love, helping and supporting the victims to transition towards forgiveness. So this is like the general framework to understand the mimetic theory. And that's why we need to revisit the idea of absolute and the absolution process. Usually in a Western understanding, the absolute, following Hegel, is reason. And that's why justice needs to be like controlled by reason, and even human rights, everything is about categories. And then, but Emmanuel Levinas, a Jewish philosopher, contemporary to Girard, in the 60s, 70s, 60s, a great decade, right? I was born that time. Levinas used to say, well, the absolute is not an idea. It's not the reason leading history towards, through progress and technique, towards the emancipation of every human being. That's a Hegelian idea of absolute. Levinas said, the absolute is the other, the face of the other, which is calling me to go beyond my own selfishness. And the face of the other is a call coming from God. Not only the cry of the other, of course, the cry is there. And he was, as a Jewish scholar, aware about the importance of the orphan, the widow, the poor, the foreigner. But it's also the love of the other. He has, Levinas has some little books about eros, desire in this way. The other is also a call. I cannot control the other. Her face, his face, the face. I cannot control their body, their mind. But I'm called to be beyond myself and engage in a new encounter with the other. So he was like criticizing deeply Hegel, and following this path, Girard said, well, the absolute in history, because we are not rational beings only. Here Hegel was wrong, Girard said. We are not only rational beings, we are also sacrificial beings. We perform sacrifices all the time. That's the origin of the culture, according to Girard. So that's why the only way to overcome this kind of idea of absolute is engaging absolution processes. And the perspective is about absolution. The only absolute in history is the victim, because it's the only one who has the power to absolve us from sin. But in this not moral sense, but anthropological sense, the victim has the power to liberate us from this never-ending process of rivalry. When the victims say, enough, that's enough. And there's something new happening, starting in my own body now, here. That's why the Girardian perspective of the absolution is very challenging, but also there's a kind of consolation. Oh, I'm using Jesuit terms. My gosh, it's becoming dangerous for me to be here. A kind of consolation, because as a starting point, I'm not accused by the other, even by God. I'm not condemned. I'm forgiven. The only way to receive myself is as a forgiving being and a forgiven being, both. So the Jesuit perspective is about absolution. And let me tell you a story that was told by another Jesuit, a friend of mine in Chiapas. It's about the Maya community in Bachajon, which is southern Mexico, Chiapas. And by the way, the Jesuits, you have a great mission there. For 60 years, you have been working with Maya communities in a process of inculturation, about liturgy, new ministries, a cooperative of coffee. Oh, if you can taste once that coffee coming from Chiapas, from the cooperative of the Jesuits, you can engage a trade fair with the Jesuit community there. It's great, good coffee. Well, this is a story about a different jurisprudence. There is a lawyer here, and probably more. So one thing is like the law as a kind of system of rules, laws, and so on. But jurisprudence is the everyday practice of communities engaging new ways of living together and then creating some rules, right? So jurisprudence, according to Mayan tradition, is very different from Western model. The subject is not an individual, it's the community. Also related to the First Nations in Africa, right? And many other continents. So let's let's read this story. I need 2 volunteers to perform these stories. And then let's reflect on this.
An indigenous man from Chiapas, Mexico, was the leader of a paramilitary group at Farmers Service and the government against the Mayan communities for more than 10 years. He committed more than 100 murders. During that time, his daughter was murdered, and he fell into depression and alcoholism. The elders of the community went to visit him to tell him, "You are part of us. Until you will heal, the community will remain sick. We come to help you. Do you agree?" At first, he angrily replied that he would never accept help. He continued to drink alcohol and stopped working for several months.
So 2 elements that are important in this first part of the story. The role of the elders in the community is crucial. The elders are not only like the people who are weak and unable to lead the community. No, they have a moral authority, a spiritual authority, the elders. And by the way, in that Jesuit mission, they create a new ministry for the elders, acknowledging this Maya tradition, saying, well, they are the reconciliators. That's their ministry. And they are sent by the community, and then there is a particular ritual where when the community is a kind of anointment, acknowledging what they do since many centuries before, but now as a part of the community, the Catholic parish. So this is a new ministry of reconciliadores, the reconciliators. I like that. So that's the second one is the different anthropological category. It's a kind of Ubuntu, right? Because we are together. If you are sick, the whole community is sick. If you're healing, then the community will be healing too. It's not the individual. That's a modern Western idea. And our First Nations around the globe, they have a different understanding of who we are. We do not exist isolated by our own, this dream of autonomy, and then it's a rationalistic dream. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I exist. Or conquero ergo sum, I conquest, therefore I exist. The second part of the story, somebody else on the back, somebody please. Help me.
Until one day, on his own feet, he went to find the community and asked for forgiveness. the elders' council met and decided to propose to him a 3-year process of repentance, justice, and reconciliation. I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Chincholin, that's his nickname.
Would have to stop drinking, work to feed 10 families of the murdered people, and be the deacon's secretary. Then, after this long process, he was welcomed back into the community.
So the penance was not a rosary, right? Praying a rosary, and then you are confessing your sins, and then, well, pray a rosary, and then you will be absolved by God. No, no, no. If the crime was so hard, 3 years process of penance. But not in a jail. That's another aspect. But connected to reconnecting that person to the community. That's a different anthropology. That's a different politics too. And that's a different spirituality about forgiveness, right? So a 3-year process of repentance, justice, and reconciliation. So, and then working harder, feeding 10 families instead of 1. You can imagine what it means, farming, right? And then deacon secretary is a big task. It's much more than being like a speaker for the grant. Deacon secretary, they accompany every Sunday the deacon presiding worship liturgies in the community, sometimes walking 3 hours to reach out the community and then back. So it was a process of penance, but helping him to reshape his own self. And that's a different approach about anthropology, about politics, economy, and so on. And then the last element, which is very important, a ritual. Rituals matter, right? Today we'll be performing a ritual together at the end of this workshop. Because a ritual is like a symbolization of all process of life. And then there were no priests here. The elders' council was presiding the ceremony of reconciliation and welcoming back to the community. Because he was, it's like the story of, welcoming back one of us. That's a different anthropology, right? So I think this is important because we need to discuss about that. The forgiveness process needs the conversion, of course, a starting point. We're talking about the perpetrators, right? And the role of the survivors. As the victims becoming survivors because they have the power to forgive. And then we are moving from justice to mercy. Because justice is about an objective way of like balancing what was wrong through vengeance and sometimes compensation, right? It's like the Western path of justice is sometimes captivated in this kind of model. But mercy is about justice, truth, and reconciliation. And that's a Christian perspective. Following mimetic desire, Jesus of Nazareth shows us the possibility of this process. And then what is important is the individual is part of a community. It's never alone. The perpetrators, they have been created by a community that haven't been taking care of them. Of course, there is a personal responsibility always, but there are many conditions that create this kind of monstrosities. There is a particular philosopher in northern Mexico, in Tijuana, the border of San Diego, California, Sayak Valencia. She tries to think how a society is producing more and more monstrosities. This kind of subjectivities that we say, oh, this is the bad guy in the story, right? Well, why is there? What kind of possibility, the family, community produced these kind of people? And we are, all of us, in charge of also healing together with him, her. Of course, giving all-time priority to the victims. So conversion process, according to this mimetic lens, is a necessary process where, well, the traditional way of talking about forgiveness, confession, penance, and forgiveness, and then the sacramental absolution is about this, remember the catechism many years ago, the confession, but actually it's a new understanding of who I am. Penance is the path of justice and retribution. It's not only like a religious act of piety. And forgiveness is like the discovery of a new self. But a new self received from the other, from the victim. And in this case, following James Allison vocabulary, is the forgiving victim. Let's watch 3 scenes of a movie, a Jesuit story, that Father Grant will contextualize a little bit about this movie that all of you know, The Mission, about the Jesuits with the Guarani people in Paraguay in 17th century, right? So you remember Father Grant, a little bit the general story, and then we will be reflecting on 3 moments in the story. Confession, then we will be moving towards the second moment, which is penance, and the last one, reconciliation, as an illustration of what is going on following the mimetic path. Please, Father Grant. You remember that movie, right? Yeah. The music by Enzo Morricone, oh, great. The scenario, the Iguazu Falls, beautiful. And the story itself, of course. The role of the Jesuit was, of course, very controversial for the Roman Catholic Church and the Guarani people, of the way they were fighting for their own identity. So, yeah, Father Grant, please.
So, many of you might have seen this movie, Mission, and it's he's going to make me cry again because it's such a beautiful, movie, so many beautiful scenes, and so let me just tell you a very quick story about what it's all about. And so it is Jeremy Irons as the Jesuit, and he's working in, is it Peru?
No, Paraguay.
Paraguay, right? So working in Paraguay, he's working in the missions there. He's built up a wonderful community where he is evangelizing.
The Guarani people.
Right. But then this is Robert De Niro, who is a slave trader at the beginning of the movie, and he is capturing the local community for slavery, but also killing the local community as he encounters them. So he's a very vicious character at the beginning of the film. But now, just before this scene, he has a duel with his brother over a woman, right? Mm-hmm. So he falls in love with his brother's wife, and they have an affair, and his brother then has a duel with him, and he kills his brother. A theme that we have been discussing this week, of course. But then this is him in prison. He is not responsible legally for the crime because it's a duel, and as a duel in those days, it was all just. Whatever happens in the duel, you submit to it. So he's not in prison according to the law, but he's in prison according to his own conscience. He killed his brother. And so this is the scene here where Jeremy Irons now meets Robert De Niro. So it's a very moving scene where he is in desolation, literally can't see a way out of his dilemma. He is being eaten up inside by the grief that he has for killing his brother, and he sees no way out of his predicament. And Jeremy Irons is trying to get him to see that there is a way out, that he can do a penance, he can seek reconciliation, seek forgiveness. But then he is disagreeing, and he is saying, there's nothing for me. There's no penance strong enough for me. There's nothing that I can do to ever overcome the guilt that I feel about what I've done. But then they end up on a cliffhanger. Jeremy Irons is saying there is a penance that is hard enough, and then he's encouraging him to find what it is that will be hard enough for him. And ultimately, I think that the second slide is what they devise together, I suppose, what comes from the victim, perpetrator, what comes from him is this idea of carrying a load, carrying armor. So this is a symbol of war, a symbol of violence. He's carrying that in a net up to the community where Jeremy Irons is in his with the community, and it's on top of a huge waterfall, and they have to climb up. So he's dragging a very heavy weight as his penance to drag it up to the community. You can see from this scene, a very moving scene, that it's heavy and you can feel that heaviness of it. Suppose he drags this heavy weight up to the top, and I don't think he knows in his own mind what's going to happen as he confronts the people that he's injured. It's a direct confrontation with the victims.
It's not the end of the story, because that community of Guarani people, represented by the child which is observing what's going on, they were facing a coming catastrophe, because of the Roman Catholic Church was not supporting anymore that mission, and the Jesuits were called to leave the place because the Pope was fighting in some way against the Portuguese regime and trying to establish a new law on who will be controlling that territory, particularly if the Portuguese crown or the Spanish one, and the Pope was trying to negotiate. And finally, because of the nuncius who was there, visiting the community, being touched by the community, but at the same time negotiating power on the top, they betrayed the Guarani community and they leave them by themselves to survive and to face the army, the Portuguese army coming. And you know what's next, Father.
So what happens, of course, is interestingly, the Robert De Niro's character wants to defend. He stays with the community and wants to defend.
He's a Jesuit.
Yes, he's a Jesuit, so he wants to defend the community against the aggression of the attackers. But he does it. He wants to take up arms against the attackers. Jeremy Irons' character. And there's a fascinating dialogue between them. Jeremy Irons' character says, if this is what God's love means, then I don't have the strength to live in this world. So he kind of takes the approach of a non-violent way of responding to the attackers. And very movingly, there's a war that Robert De Niro is fighting, you see, at the end of the movie. But then Jeremy Irons takes up the monstrance with altar service around him, and goes and faces the attackers without any guns, and just gets killed by the attackers. But then, very, very movingly, at the end of the movie, there's this the nuncio is writing to the Pope saying, "So, Your Holiness, your priests are dead, and I am alive. But it is in reality that they who are living, and I who am dead." And very, very moving kind of commentary, perhaps in the lens of resurrection. We could say that the path of non-violence leads us to life.
Well, the two of them, the two Jesuits, they were fighting for the community using different tools, I would say. One, the army, but the other was the Holy Sacrament, right? But the two of them, they remain with the community, and they died with the community. And I think that's the self-giving offering that is like the core of the story. And well, the resurrection is about that. How can we keep memory of those who have been offering their lives for the others? Of course, as Christians following Pacific mimesis, we prioritize the non-violent way, but sometimes the people need to resist, protecting themselves in that way, using arms to protect themselves, some guns and so on. So the question is, how can we go back to the survivors? Because the child who was in the scene, you remember observing, he survived. And together with his little sister, they took a little ship and then they went away. They survived. are the survivors of the Jesuit community and the Guarani people. And they're still there, 3 centuries later. So that's why probably resurrection is also, of course, about the Jesuits offering their lives, the Guarani people too, but their survivors. And I think keeping the memory alive of this community is what Teología India is doing now. Indigenous theology in South America is trying to, in some way, offer to humankind and to the church that keeping memory of those who are not anymore among us and their survivors is the only way to confess the resurrection of the crucified Messiah. The Jesuits that assassinated in that confrontation together with the Guarani people, they are alive in our memory and the community of the Guarani people today. It's not something that happened 2 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago, but now. And I think the resurrection is about this. How can we keep alive the memory of those who are gone, but they're survivors too? They help us to follow the path of the forgiving victim. And this is the lens of mimetic theory, to go back to a process of reconciliation together, not alone, together with those who are not anymore among us and their survivors. I think it's time for a last conversation. So yeah, we can engage this conversation right now.
So you need to go and watch this movie again, of course.
It's a beautiful story. Oof, very challenging.
Yes, it is challenging. But it's so beautiful for me, having seen that movie again and we again and again and again, but to see it through the lens of this, what you've been talking about, I think gives it a new freshness and a new perspective. So thank you for that. What questions or comments, perhaps? We come unfortunately to the end of our journey, or at least of input together. Please.
I don't know if I get it right, but to me, I feel like just giving love alone, without a bit of justice, not just in the courts, is enough. If someone can come to the community and shows a bit of like you are working towards those people, showing that I'm sorry of what I've done and I'm doing this, then it's gonna at least ease the humiliation, ease the embarrassment, ease the pain inside you. Because I believe the perpetrators also go through the humiliation themselves when the person that they've wronged love you utmostly. That silence, that quietness in them, it's actually a communication somehow. Then when that quietness is given to you, that resentment is being there, then when he acts on it, then I think kind of act on something. I thought he was not going to take away his life if it was going to be given that opportunity. I don't know if I get it right.
I think so. Please.
So I just listening to you, I realized the term vulnerability comes out as being really important. Robert De Niro had to be vulnerable, had to make himself vulnerable to the community, but the community, in forgiving him, also made themselves vulnerable. Vulnerable to. It takes a certain kind of courage and strength to come to your perpetrator and to even listen to your perpetrator. That takes a lot of strength, a lot of vulnerability. So it's not an easy process. I suppose this process of reconciliation is not easy. It's not easy for either side. And I think the problem with restorative justice is precisely that, first of all, there's a lot of work that has to be done with perpetrators to help them to understand what they've done and the gravity of what they've done.
And to accept that.
There was a question, there was a statement there about the possibility of perpetrators it doesn't sink in. Like the gravity of what they've done doesn't sink in. And that's a problem in the restorative justice process. But equally, even if the perpetrator comes to a space where they can accept what they've done and they're willing to engage in a restorative justice process, the victim has to be willing to come to the table, and that is also not guaranteed, and also not no one has a right to that engagement. There's no right to that process, and also we have to be careful, of course, about the gravity. I think what you mentioned is a challenge to us priests doing confession. I will never, I suppose, give a rosary out now after again a pilgrimage at least, Father, right? but what you say is very important. I think in many ways the reconciliation process, in principle, the priest is meant to be a representative of the community, accepting the person back into a communion with the community. In principle, that's meant to be the case, but it has lost a lot of its power because it's lacking a communitarian space. If we go in as individuals into confession, we of course are being reconciled with God. But if what we have done has severely hurt the community, there's no, I mean, obviously in the penance, a priest can encourage people to reconcile, to heal relationships. But when you mention that sometimes the sins are so great that a rosary just won't do. There has to be some sort of community engagement, and maybe that's important for us to go forward to think about. And as a South African community, you've given us a challenge to think in a creative space what rituals we can do, what spaces we can provide to one another to heal, and again that there's a dynamic of vulnerability. How can we make ourselves vulnerable to that space? And because the danger is you open up a big can of worms, and you could re-wound in many ways, right? And if it's not right,
re-victimize the victims. Two stories come to my mind very briefly. One, if I may.
No, go ahead.
One of them is one of my students in Boston College now. She's a Chilean lay woman working on a sexual abuse crisis in Chile. Listening to the victims of sexual abuse, adult women, abused by clerics. And her theological question is what ecclesiology is raising from their experience. And not from the perpetrators, but from the victims. And one of the difficulties that she has been exploring, facing, is how many of the victims, they don't want to talk publicly about this because the system's still there in parishes, in different dioceses. So the clerics are protecting each other. This is what Rita Segato, a great Argentinian political scientist, she says is the pact of masculinity, right? So how to accompany the victims to tell their stories, to listen to each other. That's the first step. Before opening the conversation in a public space, what is important is the victims listen to each other. In that way, they find strength. And a kind of wisdom is raising from that experience, and they create moments of healing, their memory, through rituals. Because telling the story itself is so strong, so traumatizing, that they need to receive some other support. And some artists, of course women are, not mainly women, they are supporting her in order to create this kind of narrative, a coming out narrative from the trauma of sexual abuse. So I think it's a very slow process. And what the second aspect of this dissertation is how these rituals, they represent not only a strength, a force for forgiveness, but also a new way of understanding ecclesiology, the church, the community, the body of Christ, but a wounded body of Christ, which is in process of healing together. It takes time, and then their role as forgiving victims. That's a third moment which is very complex. It's not easy at all. but it's going slowly towards this horizon. So what I want just to emphasize with this only example I want to talk is how complex is the process of forgiveness, even for the victims themselves, trying to heal together with others. But what's the role of our communities? How can we support them?
Thank you. Please.
Yes, for me, when we look at the reconciliation, also linked to healing, but for me there are two different reactions or different approaches from the victim's point of view. One approach would be to run away or to just stay away from environment that caused the sufferings. And the other approach would be to remain and to face whatever the situations or the environment or even the perpetrator, to be able to, not to confront, but to be able to understand or to follow the healing process. So between the two, how, when we look at the resurrection story, Jesus returned to Galilee and met with his disciples. So also that's a healing process in itself, and also the resurrection. But if the victim insisted that no, I cannot be here, I cannot face the fear. I think the fear is just too overwhelming. Then where do we find the reconciliation and the healing process? If the victim is not ready or willing to remain and not feeling protected or safe in that kind of environment.
Wow.
I don't know, it's just my question.
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge, to try and make sure that victims feel safe enough in their environment, safe enough in the process, and try to encourage and support to try and provide those support networks. But it's a delicate process. It's not. I get the impression it's not an easy thing to try and get right. But it also, what I find encouraging about what you were saying is that it's a we thing. It's a we question. Yeah. It's a community question. It's what can we do? How can we make the process successful?
In the case I was just talking about in Chile, I think the resistance of the institutional church to create commissions of truth, is a very bad symptom. I mean, it's a very bad sign, because if the institutional church is really willing to accompany those women, needs to open room to other aspects, of course, accompanying them, but also inviting the perpetrators, first of all, to accountability, and then also to conversion. And how can we open room to those experiences in our communities? This is a particular case, but there are so many others, right? How our communities can also open room for these kind of houses of memory and reconciliation.
So you make a very good point that victims are unwilling to make themselves vulnerable when the system is still there that perpetrates the violence. And maybe that can give us some pause to reflect on safeguarding of children and of safeguarding of vulnerable adults. How much more do we have to do to make sure that the system of violence, at least in the church, is taken away, dismantled, create those safe spaces in parishes. That's interesting that it's actually essential as a part of the healing of victims to make sure that system is converted and restructured.
I'd just like to share with you a very personal story. Is that about over 40 years ago, I decided I come from a very matriarchal family, and I decided to marry somebody who was not Chinese. And that caused, in those days especially, even during the days of apartheid, it was very difficult. But that's another side of the story. But the family side of it was that my grandmother had decided that this was totally not on. And she, I was ostracized, told my mother, just, leave her, don't consider her as your daughter. But anyway, so we got married, and, my mother reconciled my father. And so, so we were always together. And I decided, both of us, that we would carry on, be part of the family. But you could feel the divide, it was always them and us. But we just carried on. And my grandmother lived on her own in a flat, and so I used to go and visit her. And probably about 25 years ago, I was sitting there working, and I always take a knitting with me. And for some reason, she couldn't talk, because she had her voice box was taken away. And she suddenly looked at me and shouted at me. I had an idea what she was talking about, but I didn't know. And I literally left, and I stopped knitting there and then. I used to always knit and things like that. And that was interesting, because about 18 years ago, I decided, I had a little, my cousin's son was being born. I would knit something small, because that's all I knew I could manage. But in the end, I couldn't manage that. So, but what has happened is that, she's obviously died, my parents have all died, but what has happened is that an uncle died about 2 years ago, and he left a lot of money, well, a bursary for the Chinese students, university bursaries. And I was, I decided I would go and work amongst the community and work with these students. And I have to say, that is being, for me, giving back. Probably my absolution or something, but whether I will mitigate is a different matter. So.
Thank you for sharing that story with us. It's a gift to this group, and I think it helps us to understand what we're talking about in a personal way, in a very much deeper and deep way. But it's a long process, a journey, right? And I think that's it's just a very beautiful story. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, Father, I was just thinking when you were talking about the story of
Chinchulin.
How when you started saying prisons, hospital are sort of facilitating not the healing process, they are also hindering the process, also making us to be suppressed more. Like what Father said today, to say people they resist people from prison, even if they have changed, but there's sort of some resistance from us not integrating them to the community. So I can see how prison sometimes become a system that increases resilience instead of healing in the part of, and how the making process can help us if we were more forgiving and helping the person to work out a way of making up for the wrong that they've done in a certain way, instead of closing them up. Because sometimes even prison become facilitators of more crime or criminals. If you go there, maybe you stole in the street, you're maybe coming back vicious, more killing and doing even worse crimes. So I sort of understand that concept of saying we are captivated by some system. They are not helping, instead they make it worse.
You want to make some comments? No.
I wanted to also emphasize the thing of not being able to forgive, facilitating the thing of a vicious cycle, making an abuser to be the abusee to be an abuser in future, because they were not able to forgive. So they started being the victim. Now they are the perpetrator because they did not go through the process of healing and also maybe getting love to heal the process that they went through. So they feel that they must also inflict that pain to others.
So this refers to a cycle of violence that if we're not careful, then I suppose the response to violence, if it's more violence, then it kind of creates that ongoing cycle of and this is what's so beautiful about this understanding of Jesus as breaking that cycle. But it's not an easy process, and I think the first step you were mentioning is talking and also listening. This idea of letting the victims talk, because the important part of healing must be being listened to, but also feeling heard, right? I think that's what having the violence against you acknowledged is really important part of that process. But it needs a safe space, right?
Yeah, I would like just to remind us that the colonial thinking is trying to engage also a conversation, not only mimetic theory, how to face trauma in a more collective way, a critical way as communities. Because it's the individual, it's the community, but also the system, which is in some way driving our life, right? Juridical, sociological, political system, even religious systems. And so many authors, they used to say, well, the victims, they develop a kind of resilience. Is the first effect of the trauma. Resilience is a kind of a strength coming from the trauma, but is keeping them in some way captivated into the traumatic situation. Resilience is about not resisting, not yet. Resistance is the second moment. They need to fight against the system has been producing this kind of wound. But the colonial thinkers, they say, movements, we need to re-exist. It's a third moment, not only resilience or resistance, but re-existence. We need to reinvent the communities, including the perpetrators. And that's why I think the story of the Chinchulín Maya story is interesting, because it's a new way of welcoming the perpetrators and the victims in a new way of living together. Some authors like Rita Segato, I said, from Argentina, she talks about the politics of affections, a politics coming from the wounded body of women who restore among themselves their dignity, but at the same time they call, for instance, men to reinterpret their masculinity differently and to come back, right? Not only fighting for their rights as women, which is an important element, but how can we welcome back new masculinities, not non-toxic masculinities in the community, right? So the moment of re-existence, I think, is very important.
I suppose the challenge for us in this series of lectures has been to envisage a hope. So you helped us very much on the first day to enter into an acknowledgement of the crises that we're in. And you did such a good job in to try to help us understand, acknowledge the violence all around us, the violence that we are doing to ourselves, the violence we're doing to the planet around us. And then, of course, the second day you helped us to understand the importance of the voice of the victims, to listen to the voice of the victims. And I think today you've been trying to help us to look ahead, to see the hope, what shape the hope has for us. And I think we're beginning to see little elements of that hope coming through, the elements of hope that woundedness can be healed, that
hope is calling us to
hope is calling us. So that as you I think it was last week in KZN you mentioned this wonderful image of sparks
of redemption, of
sparks of redemption. So one of the challenges of the resurrection is that it's here but not yet, right? It's like the kingdom, it's here but it's not yet.
It's eschatological event.
Right. So it's rooted in our history, but we're always on the way, right? So full resurrection, of course, we're not there yet.
We hope,
but that doesn't mean that we can't feel the resurrected life already. And there are sparks of hope. There are conversations that are healing. There are acknowledgements of wounds that we can see. But I think what what you're helping us to do is to get a language a language of resistance, but not a resistance that's violent. It's a resistance of against a system that's cruel, a language that helps us to understand our desires, helps us to understand the dynamics of our communities, but also the language of we. I think the us together is an important language that we can use. And maybe the shape of our hope is creativity, letting the Spirit flow in our hearts and in our communities. Trying to, you've given us homework again to try and to try and think about, but exciting homework, I think, to try and think about what spaces we can create in our communities so that victims can be heard, also perpetrators acknowledge to be held accountable. And it has so many implications in so many different levels. It has implications for us as South Africans. It has implications for us as Christians, as Catholics, as members of our communities. Lots to think about, lots to engage with. And of course, we're going to be entering into a process of a healing in a ritual after lunch today, a healing service. We can come together and we can experience a ritual together. But before we do that, is there another question?
Yeah, it seems there are 2 or 3 people who
please.
want to.
So if it's okay,
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the movie a bit. So the thing that occurs to me is how significant courage is, and how faith needs to feed into, that courage. So to be deeply rooted in faith, the courage that is necessary. That story would have come to an end if Robert De Niro had strangled Jeremy Irons in the first scene, And that's in imminent tension. It's there. That could have happened. And the story is very powerful because we are all moved. I mean, I think most of us probably had tears, when he makes it to the top. But how significant that the victims kept their weapons and his were thrown over the edge, So all of this was a tremendously risky business. Started off by the tremendous faith that the Jeremy Irons character has, and then the willingness of how that unfolds. So in some ways, I'm not sure exactly what I'm saying, except that I'm wondering if we don't need to grow courage. We live in a world of tremendous anxiety and fear, and how is it, as communities of faith, we grow courage by deepening our faith to really understand what resurrection means and what could really have occurred, what did occur in the end when you told the story of that. So, that occurs to me tremendously. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and you'll forgive me if you address this in the first 2 days, and I'm bringing up something that is redundant. But there is also, I love this idea of a forgiving victim, and I think it's a tremendously powerful thing. But I think victimhood can also sometimes be stuck in a power that doesn't seek. You get powerful victims as well. They are not seeking to, so wouldn't it be wonderful if we could transform the powerful victimhood that is an identity often in countries that have gone through turmoil like our own into something that you own your power by being a forgiving victim. That seems significant. Thanks.
About courage, may I say something? The colonial thinkers, theologians, philosophers, they talk about combative hope. It's courage, right? It's about courage. We need to reinvent ourselves and to doing that together. The feminist theories, authors, they used to say, they use a particular word in Spanish, acuerpamiento, which is like a communal embodiment. That is like the strength coming from the victims who have been far away, from this kind of new way of becoming perpetrators. You mentioned that. So, no. The forgiving victim is about dismantling this process of control, exactly. So that's why I think this acuerpamiento, this way of reinventing us together, re-existing together again, is just, sparklers of redemption. There are anticipations. We can do this here now, in our families, in our communities, in our different groups. and not thinking anymore about the great system which will be redeeming us from hell. No, it's up to us. And then the courageous call that you are doing today, you are calling us, I think is very important. It's a way to revisit hope. And the old idea of parousia. Parousia is a gift of the Spirit in order to give testimony of the kingdom of God in history, in the wounds of history. So I think parousia is an absolutely important element in our Christian tradition.
Thank you. Just the image of Robert De Niro. Are you laughing at me? Is a stance of pride, hurt pride, but then that wonderful image of him being extremely vulnerable at the end, having almost emptied himself of all that pride, just being vulnerable, and the courage to be vulnerable.
And there is probably a last one.
We are talking about the perpetrator's conversion, so to say, through the forgiveness of the victim. But there are so many victims that kind of anonymously forgive their perpetrator, and they are also very strong resurrection figures, because quite often the perpetrator is not willing to admit, and yet I'm remembering a raped woman, how she really battled but eventually forgave the rapist, but the rapist was not coming to the table. And similar things. So many victims, not all, forgive without having the joy of the perpetrator repenting.
But you know, I think those victims, they're seeding something new, a new world. In this very personal act of forgiving by themselves, there's a seed of redemption, a sparkle of redemption, an anticipation of what we are expecting at the end of times.
Yeah. Also, there's that process of readiness. The victim needs to be ready for reconciliation, but it may never happen. They may never get there, and that's okay. But what you're saying is that even just the courageous step for forgiveness in our hearts is already a concrete step to resist the dynamic of a violent mimesis, right?